All right. Well, we are not officially starting yet because it is not yet 8 p.m. My Zoom window says live on YouTube. Oh, there we go. So, Mr. Hahn, we are now in business, and of course, we will wait until it actually turns 8 p.m. But in the meantime, I will go ahead and set up the chat really quickly, just to say welcome. Just a reminder that all right, we already have folks joining us. Hello, Emily. Hello, Tyler. Just a reminder to keep the chat school appropriate and related. Yes, Emily, everyone can see that. Yep, I can see your comments, Emily. And related to our history class. Thank you. All righty. Good deal. Mr. Hahn, 7:59. So we will we'll begin our final YouTube live review of the year. Very exciting. 6 people already watching. All right. So, Mr. Hahn, it is now 8 o'clock straight up, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. So I see a few people who are already in the chat who jumped on a couple minutes early. So I'm going to go ahead and, yes, I'm glad it's working now, Emily. So I'll give a shout out to Emily and to Tyler and Chloe and to John, who are already on joining us. I know we have a few others who are already on and joining us as well. So this is our final YouTube live review, study review, exam review for the year. Very excited to have you joining us. And hello, Nathan, as well. So here's our plan. So Mr. Hahn and I, we went ahead, we've gone through the entire review, the study guide already on Zoom on Friday. Was it Friday, Mr. Hahn, that we did that?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So, so I don't think that, hello, Shyler. I don't think that we necessarily want to spend this time to go over all of that. What I would love to do for all of you is to go over anything that you have on your mind. We'll talk about what the exam is going to be all about, what to expect. And then we may also be able to answer some questions on the vocabulary, because we didn't really go over the vocabulary at all during our review on Friday, but vocabulary is a little bit more straightforward. Also, we created a Quizlet for the vocab, so hopefully that will help you out as well. Okay, so Mr. Hahn, we have 25, currently we have 25 multiple choice questions on the exam, correct?
Wait one, sir, I'll be able to confirm.
I think that's, or approximately, I think that's what we were shooting for.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. I see 25, sir, unless I got my count wrong.
Okay. Okay, so 25 multiple choice questions. And I think Mr. Hahn and I are going to have one written response. I think that's our plan. Hello, Layla. And the way that we have organized, it. Oh, Alexa says she can't see that we're on live. We are on. Oh, you know what I should do, Mr. Hahn, is I should take this and I should also put it on Google Classroom as well.
Ah, yes.
So, okay, so we're going to put this on Google Classroom, push it out to everybody now that we have a specific link. And join us. All right, adding that YouTube link so that it'll go out to everyone. And we'll also make sure it goes out to periods 2, 4, 5, and 6. And there we go. All right. Okay, so just pushed out on Google Classroom. There we go. All right, we wanted to make sure to help Alexa because I know Alexa loves these YouTube Live events whenever we do them. So to answer the question, John is asking how many sentences will the written have? To be honest with you, John, Mr. Han and I are actually, I think, pretty ahead of the game. Typically, I'm still adding questions to the exam the morning of the exam. That's kind of how I operate because I never no exam for me is ever the same 2 years in a row. So so the exam right now is not multiple choice portion is completed. Mr. Han and I are going to go over those multiple choice questions, and then I think what's going to happen, Mr. Han and I are going to discuss this once this YouTube live study session is done this evening. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to probably come up with maybe 2 or 3 choices, and then we'll have you choose one of those. That's what we're thinking right now, or that at least that's what I'm thinking. I haven't even discussed that with Mr. Han yet, but yeah, so that's the plan. And Mr. Han, I also should let you know that Connor and Maddox last year.
I see them. I see y'all. I see you, Connor and Maddox. What's up, y'all?
Maria asks, is the study guide harmless? Maria, yes, the study guide is also one of those hold harmless items. So really, if you want to get credit for the study guide, then complete the study guide. And if you don't want to get credit for it, if you don't want to turn that study guide in, then don't worry. These 2 items, the study guide and the exam, can have the effect of improving your grade. And I think the exam, those students who are going to choose to take the exam tomorrow, of course, I am hoping in my heart that every one of my students chooses to take the exam. I know the reality is that not every student will, but I think an exam is just it's an opportunity to demonstrate your learning, to demonstrate how much you got out of this unit has been what, the last 4 or 5 weeks, would you say, Mr. Han?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So really it's an opportunity at no risk to you. If you get a good grade, in other words, if you get a percentage that is higher than the percentage that you currently have in the class, then it will improve your grade. If you get a percentage that is lower than what you have in the class, then you will see that percentage pop up instantly on Infinite Campus, but it will not hurt you at all. So, and then I think, Mr. Han, my plan would be that we would grade the writing portion separately. So that will appear just as a separate score from the multiple choice. So you could even, I think the way that I want to work that is so that the writing, if the writing helps you, it goes in. In other words, if you get, let's say it's 1 question, it's worth 5 points. So 5 out of 5, if that helps you 100%, if that helps you, then it would go in, or a 4 out of 5, which is an 80%. If that helps you, it goes in, and that would be separate. So I would look at each one of those assignments separately, and if each one of those can help your grade, it goes in, and if they can't help your grade, then it just stays out. Taylor O'Brien, hello, Taylor, it's great to see you. So Taylor, you asked, is there any way you can go over the north and south part on the study guide? I was confused, Taylor. It would be my pleasure. So I'm going to go ahead and, Mr. Han, I'm going to pull up that study guide. I've been doing a lot of other activity on Google Drive here, so I had to scroll down a bit. So let me go ahead and click present. And Alexa wants to go over the public education movement. I can do that as well. All right, so Mr. Han, I'm going to go ahead and move to screen share now, so that we are now taking a look at, this is the review slideshow. If you don't know where to find this, it's in Google Classroom, what we pushed out on Friday. You can see up at the top here, May 29th. So that was just from 2 days ago. If you didn't get a chance to catch this, Tyler, very excited to have you on the Rio TV podcast tomorrow. And hello to Tanner Bentley. All right, so let's go ahead. And Taylor O'Brien, you were asking about North versus South. So Alexa, I'm going to skip over education for a moment, just so I can get to North versus South, because this is what Taylor asked first. So we had in 2 separate presentations, Mr. Hahn, did you teach both of these, or did I teach one?
I believe I taught both of them. Yes.
Okay, good. Well, and I'm glad that Mr. Hahn got an opportunity for that practice. So, so this was in two separate presentations earlier in the unit. We did a comparison. We did the North on one day, and then we did the South on the other day. So really, there are 6 different areas. Hello, Allie St. John. 6 different areas: geography, population, economy, technology, transportation, and culture. These should be in your notes from whatever day that was that we studied the North and then we studied the South. Like I said, if you go back in time in Google Classroom, it's about 4 or 5 weeks ago, because it was towards the beginning of our unit on antebellum America. But essentially, you should know this comparison right here. The geography of the North, it was rocky soil. There were harsh, cold winters, and they had deep natural harbors. Those deep natural harbors were good for trade, right? Because if you have natural harbors, that means that ships can easily get in and out of you can basically, what you do is you build a port city around that natural harbor. So if you take a look at some of the natural harbors that exist in the United States, you have natural harbors in Boston, you have natural harbors in New York City, you have a natural harbor in Philadelphia, because what river is that connects out to the Atlantic Ocean? It's the Delaware River, I believe, that connects the city of Philadelphia to the Atlantic Ocean. Over here on the West Coast, the best example of a natural harbor that I can think of is San Francisco Bay. That is a natural harbor, right? Where you kind of have to sail in a little bit. It's protected, just like Boston Harbor is. So natural harbors, they make trade more possible, because they make it easier for ships to get in and out safely and are protected from the tides, from the waves, while they're loading and unloading cargo. So that's one thing that I would point out in the North, is those natural harbors. In the South, fertile soil and a mild climate. In the North, a very diverse population. When I say a very diverse population, I mean there were lots of different kinds of people, right? Immigrants from all over Europe, primarily Germany and Ireland. Those were the 2 primary places where immigrants were coming in the 1840s and 1850s. So by 1860 in the North, there were 21 million people. By contrast, in the South, there's not a whole lot of diversity other than black and white, right? So 5 million whites living in the South and 4 million African Americans living in the South by the time of the Civil War, by the time of 1860. Hello, Cash and Bridget. Bridget it's so funny that Mr. Hahn, we're getting all of our former students from last year coming back.
I'm seeing all of them. I'm seeing names from last year.
And I know. Hello, Bridget. Man. Good to see you. Hey, Cash, as I've mentioned it a few times, but I'll make it very clear to anyone who is still unclear. Both the study guide and the exam, they're under that hold harmless policy. In other words, they can help you, but they cannot harm you at all. So if you'd like to complete it and turn it in, I will gladly give you the points for that. And if you choose not to, then I'll just put an X for excuse in Infinite Campus. Getting back to the North versus the South, the North had a diverse industrial economy, meaning there was a factory system in the North, right? And there were lots of different kinds of industry all over the North. So different industries popping up in New York, in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Indiana, these different factories. Now, there were a few rights for workers. There were poor working conditions. We talked about that when we learned about the North as well. By the way, if you want to dive deeper into these, just go back in time and you go back into Google Classroom and you look for the North and you look for the South. And that's a good study tool if you want to dive a little bit deeper. This is just kind of a general overview. In the South, it was a plantation economy, and they just kept investing their money in more land and more slaves. In the North, they were investing in infrastructure. They were improving their factories. That's how they were using their capital, was to diversify, create more industry, create better roads and canals and railroads. And they were really building a much more robust industrial economy. The South, not so much, kept investing in land and slaves. The North, inventions galore. Are improving their lives. Things like the sewing machine, the mechanical reaper, the steam engine, the telegraph, all those different inventions that are popping up in the mid-1800s. In the South, really the biggest invention that we talked about, Mr. Hahn talked about this a few weeks ago, was the cotton gin. And that exploded a demand for slaves. And there was that second Middle Passage, right? This new demand. I'm writing that down because I want to make sure I don't forget that. This new demand for slaves. There was because the cotton gin made the separation of cotton and the seeds, pulling the seeds out of the cotton. It made it so much more efficient. It made it so much faster that they needed, in the deep South, that's where most of the cotton was being grown, places like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the deep South, right? Not a lot of cotton being grown in like North Carolina or Virginia. Those were mostly tobacco growing states. A little bit of cotton, but most of that cotton was being grown in the deep South. So there was what was called the second Middle Passage. We learned all about the horrors of slavery. If you watched the movie Amistad with your family, you know that passage, that voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to get to the Americas, it was horrible conditions. It was just an awful situation. But then they had to endure what we called the second Middle Passage, where slaves were separated from their families and they were transported from the upper South down to the lower South. So that's just a note on technology there. Transportation, we talked about this: roads, railroads, canals, and turnpikes in the North. For the South, there were some railroads, mostly just using those rivers. A few roads. Again, transportation was much more advanced in the North than it was in the South. And then finally, in the North, the culture was driven by what we call this Protestant work ethic. This idea, I think we talked about it. When did we talk about it, Mr. Hahn? I think on Friday. I used the term "idle hands are the devil's plaything." In other words, many of these Protestants at this time believed that if you were idle, in other words, you're not doing anything productive, you're just like hanging out at your house doing nothing, then that can lead to sin, that can lead to temptation. So the best way to avoid sin and temptation is to work, is to be productive. And so this Protestant work ethic meant that in the North, they believed in the value of hard work, of industry, of, you should be busy. You should be occupy your time with work that is going to be productive. In the South, different, kind of more of a laid back, more of a relaxed culture, at least relaxed for the whites of the South, because much of the heaviest labor in the South, of course, is being done by those African-American slaves in the South. Mostly Anglican and Baptist Christians. So in terms of religious diversity, much less religious diversity in the South, mostly just these two different types of Christians, and a much more rigid class structure. If you recall the Southern class pyramid, which you may remember is very similar to the medieval social pyramid, right? This idea of a very, very rigid class structure where it's very difficult to move up in the world, just like it was very difficult for a serf to become a noble in medieval Europe. That just didn't happen. It was very difficult if you were certainly if you were a slave, you weren't moving up in the South. But even those poor whites, the majority, like 50% of the population were those poor whites, it was very difficult for them to move up. There was very little social mobility in the South. Okay, so I believe, Taylor, I think I have fully answered your question. Taylor, for more information, you can go back to Google Classroom, visit the lessons on the North and the South. Okay, Mr. Hahn, what did I miss? What was the next?
I believe next was the public education reform movement that Alexa was asking about.
Yes, so let me go back now to public education. So public education really kind of falls within the what we call the reform movements of the North, Alexa. So public education was one of those things. There were 5 reform movements total. There was the temperance movement, that was the fight to restrict the sale and consumption of alcohol. There was the public education movement, the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, and then the movement to improve treatment for people with mental illness and the imprisoned population. I'm going to go back. Public education. Horace Mann, was he one of our vocab terms?
Wait one, sir.
No. Where did I put? I feel like I put Horace Mann somewhere.
Anyway,
Horace Mann was the guy who he was a teacher. I believe it was in Massachusetts, and Horace Mann is the man who was, no pun intended, who is the one who is credited with kind of sparking this public education movement. In other words, what we had before was the only people who were getting an education were the wealthy. or the upper middle class, because they could send their children, usually just their boys, to receive an education either at a private school or with a private tutor. If you were exceedingly wealthy, you would just have a private tutor in your own home. But the public education movement in the North specifically said, you know what? We believe that education is the great equalizer. We believe that public education is important for democracy. And if we truly believe that everyone in America has a chance to succeed, everyone in America should be given this opportunity, then we need to make it so that everyone in America, at least in our part of America, this is in the North, this public education movement, everybody in America has a basic education. So we've held on to this idea even to this day that every child, at least up until the age of 16, should be forced to go to school. After you turn 16, you've got some options. Still today, you can work towards getting your GED, which is sort of like the equivalent to a diploma. But we say that in our country, every child should be in school from the time that you are either kindergarten or first grade, kind of depending on the state, up until the time that you are 16 years old. We will provide an education up until the time that you're 18 years old. If you qualify for special education, then we will provide an education up until the time that you are 21 years old, and we may start it as early as 2 years old. So we really have kind of taken that and expanded those rights and expanded what we think is appropriate to offer to children and families in terms of public education. But back then, it was really just in the North where this movement was happening, not in the South. And again, you can see this note right here. Leaders in the South were afraid that education was dangerous in the wrong hands. They did not. Because of that rigid social structure, I'm not doing the Illuminati symbol. I'm doing the symbol for that social class pyramid. They believed that, at least the leaders in the South, the plantation elite, right? They believe that people should know their place. You should know your place in society. You should not aspire to move up in society. And so education only gives people hope. Education only lets people dream about a better life. And they certainly didn't want their slaves dreaming of a better life. And they didn't even want really poor whites to dream of a better life. The plantation elite, the people with the power in the South, before the Civil War, they wanted people to know their role, know their station, stay in their lane, and just be happy where they were. And so they were not offering public education. In the North, they were. Okay, Mr. Hahn, what else?
Next we have, what was it? I could have sworn I just saw one.
Well, I do see that Taylor is asking, how are we being graded on the study guide? Taylor, you're being graded for completion. I will look over it. I mean, if it looks like you just have ridiculous, nonsensical answers, then I won't give you credit. But as long as it looks like you attempted each one, then you'll get full credit for it, for sure.
Please do not copy and paste answers from the PowerPoints into these into the study guides. That will not end up well. I will be very upset if you steal some of our answers.
Put it in your own words.
Yes.
John says, wait, all these movements were like in the 1800s, right? Yes, John, you are correct. They were all in the 1800s. That is the 19th century. I'll go ahead and I'll stop the share so we can see our faces again. So the 19th century is 1801 to 1900. So when we say that these reform movements are in the mid 19th century, we're mainly talking about these reform movements kind of starting in the 1830s, 1840s, going through into the 1850s, and then of course, kind of put on hold in the 1860s for the Civil War. And then after the Civil War begins a new era of American history. Really, we kind of stopped. This is not part of what you need to know for this class, but you'll learn this in 11th grade. There was really kind of a hold placed on reform after the Civil War because the nation was just exploding economically. We were making big gains. The nation was becoming wealthier and wealthier. The people weren't necessarily. It was a lot of times at the expense of workers, but our country was growing. Skyscrapers were growing in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So anyway, that's something you learn in 11th grade. Mr. Hahn,
yes,
Taylor is asking, do you mind going over the battles of the Civil War?
Oh,
Mr. Hahn, would you mind going over, this was your area. Do you mind going over battles of the Civil War?
Oh, goody.
All righty. Mr. Hahn, take it away.
All right. If we can bring up the slideshow, sir, to the battle.
Oh, yeah. I have it right here. And yet I just forgot to click share again. All right.
Taylor, you're good if you keep, you're good about asking about going over stuff. That's what we're here for. That's what the review session is here.
Absolutely.
You got to worry about that. All right. So if you remember from the study guide, there were 8 battles, I want to say, total that we talked about, I think last week, that we kind of deemed were pretty important throughout the duration of the Civil War. The first one was the Battle of Fort Sumner. This battle took place near Charleston, South Carolina. So the Union, if you remember, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union after the election of 1860. The problem was that Union troops still held Fort Sumner, which was at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. And if you remember, between the North and the South didn't have many of these deep water natural harbors, so they had to. And they had in comparison to the North, so they were really hurting for these harbors. And one of their harbors at Charleston was pretty much under Union control, because the Union controlled a fort that could at the entrance of that harbor, so they wouldn't be able to get any ships in. So the Confederates the Confederates, they laid siege to Fort Sumner for 36 hours. And at the end of 36 hours, the Union forces at Fort Sumner, they surrendered. And then, so this was the Battle of Fort Sumner. It was significant because it was the opening event of the Civil War. It was the first, the first shot fired, I should say, of the American Civil War. So that's why it was very important. Can we go to the next slide, please, sir? All right, next we have the Battle of Bull Run. So the Battle of Bull Run, it took place 25 miles away from Washington, D.C., near a town called Manassas, Virginia. 25 miles away from Washington, D.C. It was close enough to that some of the people of Washington, D.C., the people that lived there, they actually went out there with picnic baskets and with their families to watch and spectate this battle. They thought it was going to be quick and easy. It was going to be a fast victory for the Union. But it didn't turn out to be that case. Both sides, they had very inexperienced troops, but the South, they definitely had better military leaders. If you take a look, see at the bottom right there, you'll see General Stonewall Jackson at the picture of him standing at the battle. And this is the battle where Stonewall Jackson actually got his nickname, because when the Union troops were charging his position, instead of turning around and running, he stood his ground with his troops and fought them off. And the Union troops, they were defeated at the Battle of Bull Run, and they literally ran away. They threw down their weapons and tossed all their equipment and everything, and they ran as fast as they could back to Washington, D.C. It was a complete defeat for the Union, and this was just the first battle too. So the significance of the Battle of Bull Run, it was the first major battle of the Civil War. I remember, now if you remember, I said that the Battle of Fort Sumner was an opening event, but the Battle of Bull Run was the first major battle where both the Union Army and the Confederate Army were going head to head in the field of battle. And then also another significance of this battle was that both sides found out that this war was not going to be as quick and easy as they thought it was going to be. It's going to take a lot longer. It's going to cost a lot more. It's going to cost a lot more bodies. It's going to cost a lot more lives in order to complete it. So,
yeah, Mr. Hahn, John mentioned. He says, I remember this battle because everyone thought the war would be an easy win, but it wasn't. And also, I think I found it interesting that people just showed up with picnic baskets. Like people were right on the, like on the edges of the battlefield, and they thought it was going to be like a spectator sport. And when they finally saw like people's heads being blown off and all this blood, and then a battle shifts and it moves, it doesn't just stay in one place. And so it was really quite horrific for these people that thought that this was going to be something very different than what it was. So absolutely.
Definitely. Yes, sir.
And Emily, yes, we can see your comments. All right. You want your next slide, Mr. Hahn?
Yes, please, sir.
You got it.
Thank you. Next, we got the Battle of Antietam. So this battle happened near Antietam Creek in Maryland. The commanding general of the Confederate Army, the commanding general of the South, General Robert E. Lee, he had invaded the North and he made it as far as Maryland. And his primary objective was to threaten Washington, D.C. I think General Lee figured that if he can take Washington, D.C., then he'd be able to negotiate an early victory an early victory for the South. He would be able to negotiate peace for the South and establish their independence very early in the war. But, well, it didn't really go that way neither. So at this battle, Union troops, they outnumbered the Confederates 87,000 to 38,000. So that's they had nearly twice their numbers at this battle. So the Confederates were outgunned. And that's honestly how the Union won this battle. They just had more men to throw into the fight. And that's how the Union won, but they won at great cost. 22,717 Americans on both sides were killed during this battle. To put that into kind of perspective, I think the population of Santa Clarita right now is about 200,000. So so the number of Americans killed at the Battle of Antietam is approximately 10% of the population of Santa Clarita. So, yikes. The significance of the Battle of Antietam was that the victory gave President Lincoln the opportunity to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. If you remember from, I think it was last week, what was it? President Lincoln, he wanted to announce the Emancipation Proclamation earlier, but his advisors told him to wait because the war wasn't really going that well. If they were losing, the Union was losing all their battles, and if they announced the proclamation right now while they were still losing, then it would have been seen as an act of desperation. But if you announce it after a win, it has a better tone in which when they announce it, they can announce it when they're on the up and up. And another significance of the Battle of Antietam was that it drove General Lee back into the South. General Lee took so many casualties that his army was unable to fight effectively from then on. So he had to go back to the South. He had to go back to Virginia, where he could rest his troops and then also recruit more men so that he could replace the ones that were killed in action. I think that's it for a Battle of Antietam. Sir, if we can go on to the next one. Next, we got the Battle of Gettysburg. So this battle occurred in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and you'll see a familiar name here, General Robert E. Lee again. He came into the North. He invaded the North again, except this time he made it all the way to Pennsylvania. And so he was met at Gettysburg by the Union Army, and this battle took place from July 1st, 1863 to July 3rd. 200,000 men on both sides participated in this battle. The Battle of Gettysburg was actually the largest battle of the Civil War. If you see all the pictures and the paintings of the Battle of Gettysburg throughout history, you'll see it's just characterized by troops all across the horizon. That's how many men there were at this battle. So once again, the Union was victorious at the Battle of Gettysburg, but at great cost. Again, this time there were 51,000 casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg. So that means 51,000 men were either killed, they were either wounded, or they were missing in action. So that's a lot of yikes. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of casualties, especially for a battle. The Battle of Gettysburg is actually the deadliest battle of U.S. military history to this day. We have not lost that many. I don't think we've lost that many people in terms of a single battle. Actually, the number 51,000 is actually applicable to most wars that we have fought in the United States history. So, yikes. The significance of the Battle of Gettysburg was that it was a turning point in the war because, once again, General Lee was defeated and he was pushed back to the South. But then after the Battle of Gettysburg, he would never again try to invade the North. He just couldn't muster up the men or the supplies to come back up north to try to invade and threaten Washington, D.C. again. So I think we're good on Gettysburg, sir. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Next, we have the Siege of Vicksburg. So the Siege of Vicksburg lasted more than 40 days. So for 40 days, the Union Navy went up and down the Mississippi River, just blasting the city of Vicksburg with cannon fire. You can see that on the bottom right there. So Vicksburg was part of the Union's plan to cut the Confederacy in two by controlling the Mississippi River. This was kind of in part with the Union's Anaconda Plan that they had announced early on. The Anaconda Plan was the plan included blockading the South with, blockading the southern states with the U.S. Navy, and then also cutting the Confederacy in two by controlling the Mississippi River. Then the Union was successful in controlling most of the Mississippi River until they reached Vicksburg, which was the last city on the Mississippi, and it turned out to be a 40-day siege. And John's saying, imagine just waking up to that. Yeah, that'd just be terrifying. So at the end of 40 days of being blasted apart by the Union Navy, the Confederate troops ended up surrendering Vicksburg on the 4th of July in 1863. This was the day after that General Lee was defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg. So the significance of the siege of Vicksburg was that the siege was a turning point in the war because it was also a turning point in the war because now the Union had control of the Mississippi River. They were able to effectively split the Confederacy in two. So like the southern states of like Mississippi, Alabama, the Carolinas, Virginia, Florida, and Georgia, they were all cut off from the Confederate states of the West, states like Texas and Arkansas and I forget that last one. That last one always eludes me. Yeah, I think we'll. Do you know, sir?
You're talking about the states that are west of the Mississippi?
Yeah, I always it's Texas, Arkansas,
Louisiana.
Yeah, that's the one, Louisiana. I always forget Louisiana. All right. Well, now that we got that out of the way, I think we're good at the Siege of Vicksburg, so we can move on to the next one. So this is the Anaconda Plan. This is a political cartoon of the Anaconda Plan made during the Civil War. You can see how let's dive into a little biology here. So an anaconda is a really big snake, and the way that it hunts its prey is that it wraps itself around whatever it is hunting and just squeezes the life out of it. So similar to an anaconda, the Anaconda Plan was to surround the South, surround the Confederacy. You can see the picture there, the big snake of the Union surrounding the southern states. And the plan was to starve out the South because the Navy blockade would have been able to stop any ships from going into the South or leaving the South. And also it would, and also the and then from there, the armies would come through and just crush the South, who according to the strategy, according to the Anaconda Plan, would have been starving and ill-equipped and just not all that well prepared as the Union troops would have been. So, yes. I think we're good with the Anaconda Plan, sir, if you have anything to add on that.
No, I'm good.
Thank you, sir. All right, next we have the Battle of Atlanta and also General Sherman's March to the Sea. So the Battle of Atlanta began in July of 1864. The thing about Atlanta was that it was a major supply and railroad hub in the South. What that mean? What I mean about that is that remember how the South, in terms of infrastructure and railroad, they didn't have the the North, they definitely had it better. They had better infrastructure and railroad in the North than they did in the South. The South, they had some, but not a whole lot. So the Union figured that if they took Atlanta, then that would have been a major punch to the Confederate supply train. A lot of people don't know this, but then it's not technology or leadership that actually that wins wars. It's literally men and bullets and supplies and stuff like that. If you can sustain your troops, then if you can sustain your troops and continue to sustain them, that's how you win wars. Okay, so Union forces under General William Tecumseh Sherman, they captured Atlanta in September of 1864. General Sherman then continued east towards Savannah, Georgia, in his infamous March to the Sea. During this march, Union forces destroyed both military and civilian targets under a policy of total war. General Sherman, he believed that, if the Confederate Army, they were being supported by the civilian population, by the civilian economy of the South, well, then we're just going to target the civilian. We're just going to target the civilian economy and infrastructure in the South then. So if you see on the bottom right there, you'll see Union troops. They're tearing up the railroad tracks. They're chopping down the telegraph poles, and they're burning plantations, it looks like. And they're freeing slaves too. Because remember, the slaves, they were the main source of labor for the South. And they were really dependent on slavery down there in the South for that plantation economy. So by taking away all these all these that are shown in the picture, that it really hurt the South militarily and economically as well. That's what General Sherman was going for when he said we're going total war on this. So the significance of the Battle of Atlanta and Sherman's march to the sea was that the South never really recovered from these events, especially the march to the sea. And they never really recovered during the war from the March to the Sea. I should say that after the war, they did get some help in rebuilding, but for the rest of the war, from 1864 to 1865, the South did not recover from this policy of total war. And also, because of this total war, it helped lead to the South's surrender later on at Appomattox Courthouse. Angela, is this going to be the multiple choice questions test? Yes, it is. We're just going over some of the questions that students have about the study guide on what's going to be on the test. Angela, thank you for that. I think we're good here at Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea, sir. If we can move on to the next slide, please.
Gotcha.
Yes, sir. And next we have lastly we have the Battle of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox. So if Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy, sort of like exactly like how Washington, D.C. was the capital of the United States of America. So the city of Petersburg was kind of in between. No, before we get into that. So General Ulysses S. Grant, by this time, he was the commander-in-chief of all the armies in the United States of America. So he was in charge now, and he wanted to go and get Richmond, Virginia, because if you cut the head off the snake, then the body's going to die. So he thought, if we're going to take the capital of Richmond, Virginia, then the rest of the Confederacy is going to soon to follow. But the only problem was that the city of Petersburg was in between General Grant and Richmond. So General Grant ended up laying siege to Petersburg for 9 months. 9 months. Good God. The siege, which was really characterized by trench warfare and just cannons going and blasting everybody apart. The siege ended when General Lee ended up abandoning Petersburg and Richmond to retreat west. General Lee figured that his position wasn't really that defendable after 9 months of siege. So he ended up retreating out west. And General Grant actually chased after him. He chased after him, unlike his predecessors, and he caught up to General Lee at a place called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th in 1865. And after a short battle, General Lee understood that he wasn't going to be able to win this. He wasn't going to be able to win this fight. So he ended up surrendering to General Grant in the house of Wilmer McLean, actually. Fun fact about Wilmer McLean, the Battle of Bull Run started in his backyard. And what was it? At the end of the Civil War, the Confederates surrendered, General Lee surrendering to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. It was actually in his front parlor. So it was, I don't know what are the odds of that, but somebody get that man a lotto ticket. He'd probably win that too. So the significance of the Battle of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox was that it signaled the end of the Civil War. There was still sporadic fighting that happened after the surrender at Appomattox, but General Lee was pretty much the great, I want to say, he was pretty much the greatest commander of the Confederacy. And with him surrendering, well, the rest of the Confederates, they saw what happened. They figured we can't fight without General Lee, so they started surrendering too. And eventually, they all surrendered, and the Civil War was done. Emily Swift, hey, you guys won't believe what happened in my house. Yeah, that's true.
Right.
I think that covers the 8 battles that we deemed important for this Civil War unit, Taylor. If that did answer your question, if not, there's another presentation that we did the week before, or was it 2 weeks before? I'm not sure when exactly. It covers more details, and we also have the recap video of it as well. You can watch. So
we do, yeah. So a couple different places that you can go. I'm going to exit. I see that Alexa just asked about question 17, so I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But I want to show you a couple of things if you are studying tonight or you're going to be studying tomorrow morning. The first I want to show you is Google Classroom. And with Google Classroom, you can go back, and if we click here and you go to classwork, I have taken a good deal of time to organize everything by day because, we kind of switched away from MrIppolito.com, and all the organization now is here in Google Classroom. So if you go back in time, you can see, because this is where the unit exam was for Manifest Destiny. So we started learning this new unit on April 20th. So if you want to learn more about 19th century reforms, you click there. Seneca Falls Convention, the slavery, that was the video, the Civil War video, more on slavery, and then the Civil War. So every one of these agendas here has the slides, has the information, has the lecture. And then if you go to my YouTube channel, then there is the recap video for all of them. Mr. Hahn, the only classes that don't have a recap video are the ones where we didn't teach anything in class that day. It was a couple of those days, but instead we watched a video. We watched either a PBS video or, but you can see, if you go back in time, you can see like we had, and if you go back to, right here, April 20th, that's reform movements right there. So you could watch every one of these videos. We're all on YouTube here, and you can see the recaps, or in some cases, a couple of these I recorded the full class. So these ones that are a little bit longer, you can watch the whole thing. It's totally up to you. I'm not even sharing my screen, am I, Mr. Hahn?
Oh no, you're not, sir.
I'm talking about
I
stuff.
wasn't aware that you were supposed to be.
I'm talking about stuff, and I'm not even, you can't even see it. Okay, now I've hit screen share, and so now you can see on my YouTube channel, you can see all of the videos here that are part of the collection. Just going back in time all the way to April 20th. That was the first day of our new unit right there, April 20th, and then you can watch all of these. Okay. Alexa is asking for question 17, Mr. Hahn, and so
question 17. I don't see question 17.
There is no 17.
But so it could be different on her version of the study guide.
Maybe the numbering is a little bit different. Alexa. Oh, and Taylor says, yes, very much. Thank you. So good job, Mr. Hahn.
Thank you.
You got Taylor's seal of approval. Alexa, if you can tell us what your question 17 says, because mine only goes up to question 16, and then we have the vocabulary. So Alexa, if you can just tell us what that question is, then I might be able to better help you. Actually, I could also, because Mr. Hahn, I've got the technology at my fingertips here, I can also look, and if I can scroll in, aha. So Mr. Hahn, it's actually, Alexa, I see your question 17. I don't know what happened to your numbering, Alexa. Yeah, but anyway, Mr. Hahn, I can see. Question 17 is the Abraham Lincoln question. Yeah, so that is also, I think we can go to the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, and I can do a screen share on that. So, Mr. Hahn, do you want to talk about Abraham Lincoln, or would you like me to talk about Abraham Lincoln?
I think this was all you, sir, because Abraham Lincoln is your favorite president.
He is my favorite president. So Alexa, I will just, no, that's fine. You don't need to apologize. We got the numbering a little mixed up there. So number 17 talks about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. For many of you, and I know the numbering may have been different depending on your study guide. But anyway, the question is, how was Abraham Lincoln uniquely suited to be president of the United States during our nation's greatest challenge, the Civil War? And goodness knows, my goodness, our nation is having great challenges right now. But I think historians would still argue that the greatest challenge in our nation's history has been the Civil War. And so that's what we're talking about. Abraham Lincoln led us through the Civil War. What qualities did he possess that helped him guide our nation through this crisis and keep our country together? So, Alexa, one of the things that Mr. Hahn talked about a few classes ago was that President Lincoln exhibited these three traits. He was committed, he was compassionate, he was charismatic. Committed meaning he had a goal that he wanted, that he set for himself and for our country, and he saw it through to the very end. President Abraham Lincoln, he started the war, and he got himself reelected. He did not, it would have been really tempting during a time of war for President Abraham Lincoln to try to say, you know what, we're not going to have elections. We're going to go ahead. This is such a trying time in our country. I'm just going to go ahead and declare myself president for a couple more years. And that might have been tempting for him, but he still, through this war, he thought, you know what, it is important to have an election. It is important for democracy to continue, for our nation to make a choice. You can choose me, or you can choose George McClellan. Talk about an interesting turn of fate. George McClellan, who was at one time the general who reported to Abraham Lincoln, he was such a difficult general to work with. And then it turns out that General George McClellan ends up challenging Abraham Lincoln for the presidency in 1864. But Abraham Lincoln says, you know what? I've got a vision. I've got a plan. I'm going to see it through. Abraham Lincoln was committed. That was the first C that Mr. Hahn talked about. The second C he talked about was compassionate. So Abraham Lincoln, he was compassionate for slaves. He believed that slavery was wrong and that slavery should end. However, Abraham Lincoln was also compassionate toward the South. He did not want the South, the whites of the South specifically, to be punished, to be hammered, to suffer, to be made to suffer after the Civil War was over. He had a plan to very kindly, very lovingly bring the traitors, because that's what they were after all. The Confederates were traitors, right? They took up arms against their country, against the United States. And so he could have said, you know what? Death to everybody. Death penalty, you all have committed treason. But instead, he wanted a path of compassion. He wanted to bring them back in and embrace them again as Americans, bring our country together. In Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, just a month before he was assassinated, we didn't really get a chance to talk about this speech, but in his second inaugural address, he says, with malice toward none, with charity to all. In other words, you know what? I'm not mad at you. This was a trying time for our entire country. We want to bring you back in with loving arms. Let's let our nation heal. Let's bring our nation back together. So he was compassionate. Mr. Hahn, thank you for throwing that in the chat there. And then finally, Mr. Hahn argued that Abraham Lincoln was charismatic. So Abraham Lincoln, he was, many historians believe that he dealt with depression. And so he dealt with, actually, historians believe that both he and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, they both suffered from mental illness and both suffered from depression, perhaps some anxiety as well. So they were both dealing with some issues. President Lincoln frequently would share stories of how he dreamt of his death and how he would, how he was going to die. And so he really had some dark moments in his life, but in spite of all that, he was funny. He joked all the time, like made jokes about himself. There was some woman who didn't like him, and so she said to him one time, "Sir, you are two-faced." And now normally two-faced means like, you say one thing but you do another thing. "Sir, you are two-faced." And Abraham Lincoln, who kind of, he wasn't the most attractive man on earth, he responded to the woman. He says, "Ma'am, if I truly did have two faces, do you think I would show this one?" In other words, I'm kind of ugly. Would I, he had a way of making fun of himself. of being self-deprecating. He was very humble, but he was very charming as well. And he was, he was kind of this father figure to the nation. And so when he was assassinated, one of the things that John Wilkes Booth, who he was convinced that John Wilkes Booth was the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He shot him in the back of the head in Ford's Theater on April 14th, and then jumped and said, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is a Latin phrase which means "thus always to tyrants." It was the phrase that Brutus yelled on the floor of the Senate when he stabbed Julius Caesar in the back, back in ancient Roman history. And so John Wilkes Booth believed that he was doing a great service to the country, just like Brutus thought he was doing a great service to the Roman Empire by murdering Julius Caesar. John Wilkes Booth thought he was doing a service to the country by murdering Abraham Lincoln. But instead of John Wilkes Booth becoming a hero, becoming hailed as, this savior of the nation who killed this tyrant, what he did was he transformed Abraham Lincoln into a martyr. That's one of your vocab terms, right? Martyr, someone who dies for a cause. So, and John Wilkes Booth also wasn't thinking, because our nation is still, majority of the people in our nation today are Christians. That's the majority religion in our country. Back then it was super, super Christian. Like the vast majority of people were very deeply religious, practicing Christians. And John Wilkes Booth murdered Abraham Lincoln on Good Friday. And Good Friday, if you are aware of Christian tradition, Good Friday is also the day that Jesus was crucified. And so it was kind of bad timing on the part of John Wilkes Booth, because it's almost in a way, there's some historians who say that by murdering Abraham Lincoln on Good Friday, he almost elevates him to this Christ-like status, to this person who sacrificed, who gave his life for his people, just like Christians believe that Jesus gave his life to redeem the sins of the world. Abraham Lincoln gave his life to redeem the sins of our country. And so Lincoln becomes a martyr, becomes a hero, and not this villain that John Wilkes Booth thought that the country was going to see him as. Anyway, long story short, Mr. Hahn believes that Lincoln was committed, he was compassionate, he was charismatic. And Mr. Hahn, I am going to wholeheartedly agree with you on all three of those. Emily Swift says, wasn't John Brown also a martyr? Those people who believed that John Brown did a good thing and died for a good cause in trying to arm the slaves of the South and lead an armed slave uprising. Yes, there were many people who saw John Brown as a martyr as well. So really, to see someone as a martyr, you have to believe in their cause. So I'm guessing that most of the whites in the South would probably see John Brown as a traitor and a villain, but there were several people in the North and several slaves in the South were like, dang, this white guy he sacrificed his life, he risked his life and ultimately was executed trying to do something good for us. And so John Brown, fascinating character in American history. A lot of books written about John Brown.
Indeed.
All right, Mr. Hahn. Wow, it is almost 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
we have been talking history for almost an hour. Okay, so I'm just scrolling back through the chat again just to make sure that we got everybody. I think we addressed John and we addressed Taylor. I think we answered Alexa's question. Angela, Emily, I think we got to everybody.
I think we did.
Yeah. So folks, this is a final opportunity to kind of think of any other questions you might have that we can answer quickly. We're scheduled to wrap things up around 9 o'clock. I will tell you this, that the test day is tomorrow. Mr. Hahn and I have made that decision that the test will open at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, the same moment that class begins. Mr. Hahn and I, of course, will be on hand to answer any questions or clarify anything. We'll be on Zoom. We're just hanging out from 10:30 to noon. You do not need to come and join the Zoom. That is not required. You can just take the test. But if you want to come and hang out, just hear us, chatting in the background, whatever, you're welcome to. Alexa asks, is the test open note? Alexa, the test is open note. It is open internet, open YouTube, open Google. You just shouldn't talk to anybody else. You're on your honor it's the honor system to not try to get help from your parents or from friends or from family members or anybody else, but any other internet resources, notes, everything, it is wide open. So we tried to ask questions that will be challenging enough so that they are not easily Googleable. Emily says, how long is the test? Like, how long will it be open for? So Emily, 25 multiple choice questions. I think Mr. Hahn and I are going to have 3 short answer questions. And of those 3, I think you're just going to choose one to write on. I think that's my plan for right now. And Emily, the test will be open at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow and will close at 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night. So you get one day, because again, we need to, especially if we're going to have a written portion, Mr. Hahn and I need time to read. Yeah, we have a total of 140 responses. So so we need time to read all of these responses. The multiple choice, it will score instantaneously. So you will see those results as soon as you take it. So, of course, I'm encouraging every student to take the test during the history window. Why wait? Why delay? Just take it. Take it when it's your normal history time that you would normally be doing history anyway. Taylor asks, when is the study guide due? Taylor, the study guide is meant for the exam, and you have to take the exam sometime tomorrow. So Taylor, the study guide will be due at 11:59 p.m. tomorrow. Same as the deadline for the test.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, 11:59 p.m. tomorrow, Taylor. Cool. All right, Mr. Hahn. Well, it is 9 p.m. straight up, and I believe we have answered all the questions. We've had a great discussion on history, on the Civil War. I always enjoy talking about Abraham Lincoln, so that got me super excited. So that was a lot of fun. So folks, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube Live. And once again, Mr. Hahn and I will be jumping on Zoom. Same code as always tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. We'll be on from 10:30 to noon. So you can pop in anytime between 10:30 and noon if you have a question, if there's something you want clarified. Please pop in during that time. We may not be available at other times. And also, I'm still teaching another class. I still have Rio TV that I'm teaching in the afternoon. We're doing our final podcast, Rio TV podcast. By the way, if you want to join us on our podcast, we always have a lot of fun. Tomorrow's our last one, and anybody who wants to join us, you can jump on. So Mr. Hahn, we're going to be starting our podcast at 2:00. So you're welcome to join us.
I'll see if I can schedule open.
2 p.m., Mr. Hahn.
All right.
Anyway, folks, thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate you being here on our YouTube Live. Taylor, thank you. Emily, thank you. I don't know who all we have left. Alexa, John, whoever else, Angela, if you're on there. Emily, I might have already said your name. Anyway, to everybody who's on here, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll look forward to either seeing you tomorrow morning or seeing you taking the test tomorrow morning. And then we'll have, of course, our final celebration, our last day of class. So please join us on Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. for our end of the school year celebration. Folks, thank you so much. Have a good evening and good luck on your test tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.